In April of 1857, a cotton broker traveling from Charleston stumbled onto something at Moss Creek Plantation in Middle Georgia that would shadow him for the rest of his life. While reviewing ledgers, he noticed a chilling pattern hidden in the numbers. Over 15 years, 23 young men had been sold, each fetching unusually high prices, each tagged with the same cryptic note, prime condition certified. At the time, he couldn't have known that those words hid a secret so dark it would one day threaten to tear apart the reputations of some of Georgia's most powerful families. For decades, officials buried evidence, burned records, and silenced anyone who dared to talk. But the truth has a way of clawing its way back to the surface, especially when someone records it with the precision of Eleanor Cresswell, a woman who believed the pen could wound far deeper than the whip. Moss Creek itself was nothing like the grand estates that symbolized Southern wealth. Spread across 370 acres of Georgia clay, between the Oconee River and the county road leading from Milledgeville to Augusta, it looked modest by comparison. No towering columns, no manicured gardens, no lavish galas. The main house was a simple 2-story timber structure ringed by 12 slave cabins, a cotton gin, a smokehouse, and a barn that seemed far too large for a plantation of its size. Eleanor Cresswell inherited the property in 1840 after her husband Thomas died suddenly of what was called apoplexy. At just 31 with no children, neighbors assumed she would sell and retreat to Savannah, where her family's shipping business thrived. Instead, she fired her overseer, took control herself, and within a year, turned Moss Creek into one of the most profitable mid-sized plantations in the county. Her method was cold, calculated, and unlike her peers, she called it strategic acquisition and disposal. While most planters held on to their enslaved laborers for generations, building families across decades, Eleanor treated people as assets in a portfolio. She bought young men, kept them for a year or two, then sold them at staggering profits to planters across Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, where demand for labor was endless. The women she kept, never more than a handful at once, were older past childbearing years, chosen specifically so no children would be born into Moss Creek. For Eleanor, families were messy, inefficient, and in her view, unnecessary. She wanted labor, profit, and something else entirely. Something darker her neighbors would never see coming. By 1845, Eleanor had a reputation that made even her most skeptical male counterparts begrudgingly respect her. They couldn't ignore her mastery of crop yields, market timing, and soil management. Even if they disapproved of her refusal to attend church host gatherings or participate in the rituals of Southern womanhood. When pressed about her ways, she would simply smile, a thin, sharp expression that held no warmth, and remark that widowhood had freed her from the burden of pretending. What none of them knew was that Eleanor kept not one ledger, but 3. And inside those hidden books lay the truth about what Moss Creek really was, not just a plantation, but a machine that consumed lives and hid its secrets in plain sight. Eleanor Cresswell's 3 ledgers told 3 very different stories. The first was for public eyes, simple plantation accounts showing expenses, harvest yields, and sales ready to satisfy any neighbor or tax man. The second was for herself, a truer picture of Moss Creek's wealth, listing profits far higher than the official numbers suggested. But it was the third book, hidden in a locked iron box beneath her bedroom floorboards, that revealed what Moss Creek really was. Written in a cipher she had learned from her father's shipping business in Savannah, it contained names, dates, and descriptions so precise they read like anatomical studies: eye color, hair texture, the angle of a jaw, even the way skin appeared under lamplight. What looked like meaningless detail was in fact a catalog, a genealogy Eleanor was carefully building to serve a purpose no one else could have imagined. Life at Moss Creek followed an exact routine. Every new arrival was the same young male between 18 and 25, strong and unbroken. For the first week, he was kept apart from the others. No one dared whisper why, but everyone knew. On the 7th night, Eleanor summoned him to the house. What happened behind those locked doors no one ever described, but the house slaves noticed patterns. Eleanor always bathed first. She always wore the same plain gray dress. Her lamp burned past midnight, and by morning the man she had called to her room moved differently, as if something inside him had been broken. His shoulders slumped, his eyes avoiding all others. The next day, Eleanor would sit in her study for hours, with her iron box open filling pages with her coded observations, as if she were recording testimony in court. The first disappearance came in 1843. A man named Samuel was sold for an extraordinary $1,800 to a planter in Alabama, but he never made it there. The buyer wrote furious letters demanding answers. Eleanor replied with flawless paperwork and a calm assurance that the man must have run off on the way. Slaves fled all the time she reminded him, and the matter was quietly dropped. 6 months later, another man vanished, this time en route to Mississippi. Again, Eleanor's records silenced suspicion. One runaway was bad luck, two was coincidence. By 1847, 5 men from Moss Creek had disappeared without explanation. The buyers were scattered across 3 states. Communication was poor, and Eleanor's reputation for meticulous honesty kept her above reproach. No one dared suggest the truth that none of those men had gone west at all. Their bodies lay in shallow graves on Moss Creek land in a rocky stretch Eleanor had declared unfit for cotton and promised would one day become an orchard. The orchard never came, but the soil grew heavy with the dead. Eleanor's killings followed a pattern as careful as her ledgers. After the ritual in her bedroom and her private notes in the cipher, she treated each man well. She fed him generously, built up his strength, even hired doctors to certify him in prime condition. Then she arranged a sale, always distant, always through intermediaries. 3 nights before he was due to depart, she lured him to the oversized barn that neighbors found strangely out of scale for a plantation of Moss Creek size. At the far end of the barn was a locked room, a space no one else ever entered. There she offered him whiskey, a gesture of kindness before the long road ahead. But the drink was laced with laudanum enough to weaken, not to silence. Eleanor wanted them awake. She wanted them to hear her as she opened the ledger, pointing to her neat observations, calmly explaining how his features echoed those of men he had never met, men whose names meant nothing to him. In that moment, he realized too late he had not been bought and sold as labor. He had been catalogued, measured, and chosen for a darker purpose. And then she would tell him exactly what she planned to do, with what she had catalogued, how she intended to use faces and facts, to shred reputations, to expose hypocrisy, and to bring down the very social order that had turned her life into a ruin. She watched each man's face as understanding crept in. Watched him realize he had been chosen not for labor, but for proof. And while laudanum slid him into a half-wakeful stupor, she called for the only person who knew the full scope of her design. The only person she trusted to finish what she had started, the son whose existence the records denied. Henry Cresswell was supposed to be a ghost. All public papers, every census and church roll recorded Eleanor and Thomas as childless. Those records were true enough on paper and false in the bedrock of her life. Eleanor had given birth as a girl years before her marriage to a child whose father was a dockhand who worked for her family. The scandal would have ruined her standing in Savannah, so the infant was sent north to an aunt in Philadelphia and raised as another household's child. Eleanor visited in winter, always under the safe cover of family duty. And the boy grew up knowing who his mother was and what he could never be in public. He also grew up knowing what his father had been and what became of him. A man sold south and worked to death in Kane. a death Eleanor never forgot and never forgave. Henry returned to Georgia years later, posing as Henry Bell, a respectable traveling merchant from Philadelphia, bringing with him the veneer of legitimacy that allowed him to move through towns to rent rooms and to enter Moss Creek without arousing the curiosity that would have stopped a known relation. He slept in the house, shared long nights with Eleanor over the ciphered ledger, and learned the cruelty of her method until it became his. The barn had more than hay. Behind its measured facade was a trap door and a cellar where implements waited and where privacy was absolute. Eleanor did not buy at random. She shopped markets like a breeder, but she looked at faces, not teeth or muscle, tracing the inherited marks of the region's ruling families. The small nose, the set jaw, the strange gray-green eyes that recurred in a single line. She had spent years mapping family trees and whispered sins, gathering the names of planters who had fathered children in secret, the men who kept second households, the men whose arrogance made them careless with their own legacies. That network of rumor and loyalty and gossip, carried in the voices of house slaves and porters, gave her the keys to a society that believed itself invisible. When she found a young man whose features matched the proof she sought, she bought him, fed him, fattened him, certified him as prime, and then staged his sale far enough away that a missing man could be blamed on the road. 3 nights before departure, she offered whiskey laced with laudanum and the ledger open on the table. She read aloud, precise and calm, explaining how his face linked him to a name that could unmake a family. The horror was not in violence alone, but in the deliberate exposure of truths plantation masters had spent their lives denying, and Henry, raised to understand both commerce and secrecy, helped make sure those exposures could be explained, buried, or weaponized, all according to the cold plan Eleanor had drawn in ink and cipher. Eleanor's ritual was never just about possession or cruelty. It was about building a record so undeniable it could one day dismantle the very pillars of Southern society. Every man she brought to Moss Creek was measured, studied, and documented with painstaking precision. Eye color in daylight versus lamplight, the curl of hair, the freckles on a cheek, the tilt of ears, every mark that might trace lineage back to men who claimed purity, yet fathered children in secret. She wasn't compiling this evidence for courtrooms. She knew well enough that no Southern jury would ever rule against the families she intended to expose. Her weapon wasn't law, it was shame, proof that the proud men who thundered about racial purity had for generations crossed their own forbidden lines. These young men became living proof of hypocrisy, and then inevitably, they became something colder. Dead proof. Evidence that could not speak back, could not be moved beyond her reach, could not vanish into the world. By 1850, 13 men lay buried in the rough soil of Moss Creek's forbidden section. 13 coded entries in Eleanor's hidden ledger. 13 families marked for ruin whenever she chose to reveal the truth. But time was moving faster than her plans. The compromise of 1850 had cooled tempers for a moment, but everyone sensed the fragile truce could not hold. War was coming, and with it the risk that her years of careful work might collapse before her accusations could ever be heard. Then in the summer of 1856, everything shifted. A letter arrived from Boston addressed to Widow Creswell. The sender, Daniel Harrington, a lawyer and correspondent for The Liberator, wrote that he had heard troubling rumors about Moss Creek, its unusual turnover of slaves, the men who vanished after being sold. He planned to visit Georgia that fall and hoped to speak with her. Eleanor read the letter 3 times, calm and steady as ever, before showing it to Henry, who was visiting that week. "Someone has been talking," she said. "Someone knows more than they should." Henry suggested silence retreat, waiting out the storm. But Eleanor's thin smile hardened. "No," she replied. "We invite him. We let him see exactly what he expects. and then we find out who sent him and what he truly knows. What Eleanor didn't realize was that Harrington's letter wasn't simply a question, it was a warning. A signal of the storm about to break. When he arrived at Moss Creek on September 15th, 1856, in a modest carriage hired in Milledgeville, he cut the figure of a working lawyer, thin, pale, ink-stained, with a frayed collar and a Boston suit far too heavy for Georgia heat. Eleanor received him in her spotless but plain parlor, the setting carefully chosen to project nothing more than competence and modest success. Harrington believed he was stepping into a conversation about missing men. In truth, he had walked straight into the heart of Eleanor Creswell's labyrinth. Eleanor Creswell made sure her parlor looked exactly as it should, plain, respectable, unremarkable. No gilded mirrors, no imported carpets, nothing to hint that Moss Creek yielded more than her official accounts suggested. She poured Daniel Harrington a glass of cool water and let him speak first. His Boston accent cut sharp against the heavy Georgia air. "Mrs. Creswell, I'll be direct. I've received word from sources that your plantation operates under unusual circumstances. That you keep only male slaves, sell them after short periods of time, and that several have disappeared during transport." Eleanor met his gaze without the slightest flicker of unease. "You've been misinformed, Mr. Harrington. I maintain a small number of women for domestic work. The men I purchase stay for a year or two. I improve their health, strengthen them, then sell them to planters farther west where demand is high. If some vanish on the way, that reflects their own choices, not my practices. I provide every buyer with proper papers and medical certifications. I do not control what men do when freedom lies on the open road before them." Harrington removed a small notebook from his pocket, the edges worn from use. "I have 5 documented cases, Mrs. Creswell. 5 men sold by you who never arrived. 5 vanishings in 12 years. Statistically, that is more than chance." It seems Eleanor replied smoothly that a lawyer from Boston is seeing patterns he wants to see. "You came here hoping to uncover scandals, something to thrill your abolitionist friends, but you'll find nothing of the sort. Moss Creek is a lawful enterprise, nothing more." "Then you won't mind if I remain in the area?" Harrington countered. "Speak with your neighbors, perhaps interview your slaves." Her face did not change. "You're free to waste your time. My neighbors will tell you what you already know, that I run an efficient plantation. As for my slaves, you and I both know their words hold no weight in court. They'll say what they believe you wish to hear. But if you insist, I won't stop you. Just remember, Georgia isn't Boston. Folks here guard their own. They don't look kindly on outsiders with questions." It wasn't an outright threat, but Harrington felt the warning beneath her tone. When he left Moss Creek that day, doubt gnawed at him. She had been too prepared, too calm, her answers smooth as polished stone. Every explanation lined up. Every document she claimed was in order. On the surface, Eleanor Creswell was exactly what she appeared to be, a widow, managing a plantation with sharp efficiency. But Harrington hadn't survived as a lawyer in the abolitionist cause by trusting surfaces. He lodged at a boarding house in Milledgeville and spent 3 days digging quietly. He spoke to merchants who had sold to Moss Creek, to planters who dealt with Eleanor, even to the doctor who signed health certificates for her sales. Each account was the same. Eleanor was unusual, yes, but honest to the core. A woman alone, but fair and competent. Then, on the 4th night, the investigation took an unexpected turn. After dusk, a knock rattled his door. An elderly black woman stood in the hall, her back stooped but her eyes sharp. She introduced herself as Ruth, a house slave from Moss Creek. She said she had worked there since before Thomas Creswell's death, and she had things to tell, things no one beyond the plantation's borders knew. Inside Harrington's rented room, Ruth sat in the only chair, her hands twisting in her lap, and spoke in a voice low and urgent. She told him about the men Eleanor purchased, about the strange seventh night when each was summoned to the main house, about how Mrs. Creswell spent long hours afterward in her study, with ledgers no one else could see. She whispered about the barn, about the locked room at the back, and the sounds she sometimes heard late at night, sounds that made her blood run cold, though she could never describe them clearly. "She ain't right," Ruth said, shaking her head, voice cracking with fear and certainty. "Something wrong with Miss Eleanor. Been wrong since Mr. Thomas died. Maybe before. She got a coldness in her, a planning coldness. And them young men she buys, they don't all get sold away, like she says. Some of them, they just vanish one night and we never see them again." "Do you know what happens to them?" Harrington asked, his voice low but urgent. Ruth shook her head. "Nobody says it out loud. But there's a part of the land she won't let nobody touch. Says she's saving it for an orchard. Ground's been dug up, filled in more than once. And I've seen her there late at night with that man." She stopped suddenly, lips pressed tight, as if she'd already said too much. What man? Harrington pressed. "The equipment man. Mr. Lale, he calls himself. Comes regular, sometimes stays for days. She says he's selling her tools, but I don't see no new tools. What I see is them two bent over her books, whispering, planning something." Ruth rose, then glancing toward the door as if afraid someone might be listening. "I shouldn't have come. If she finds out, God help me. But someone needs to know. There's evil at Moss Creek, Mr. Harrington. Evil that needs stopping." After she left, Harrington sat in silence, the flickering lamplight casting long shadows across the walls. If Ruth spoke the truth, then Eleanor Creswell was not simply running her plantation in some unusual way. She was hiding something criminal. But what exactly, and how could he prove it? The next morning, Harrington saddled a rented horse and rode back to Moss Creek unannounced, hoping surprise might shake something loose. But when he arrived, Eleanor was in the yard directing men as they loaded bales of cotton. She greeted him with calm indifference, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mr. Harrington, back so soon I thought you'd be finished by now. I'd like to see your property," he said firmly. "All of it, including the outbuildings." Her smile thinned, but her tone stayed pleasant. "Of course, though I doubt you'll find it worth your time." She led him around the grounds, the gin, the smokehouse, the cabins, each space tidy, ordinary, exactly what one would expect. Nothing betrayed the whispers he carried in his notebook. At last they came to the barn. Eleanor swung the big doors wide, letting sunlight spill over stacked hay and farm equipment. "And the back room?" Harrington asked. He gestured toward the smaller door he'd noticed before. "Storage," Eleanor said lightly. "Old tools, broken equipment, nothing of interest. I'd like to see it." For the first time she paused. A flicker crossed her eyes, not fear, but something colder, sharper. Calculation. She weighed his request, then drew a key from her pocket and unlocked the door. The room beyond was exactly as she described, dusty, cluttered, forgotten. Rusted blades, tangled rope, cracked barrels. Cobwebs sagged in the corners. Harrington moved carefully through the space, heart pounding, searching for any trace of Ruth's story. But there was nothing. No stains, no signs of struggle, no hidden compartment or grisly evidence. Just a neglected storage room. When he emerged, Eleanor leaned against the doorframe, watching him. Satisfied, she asked, her voice cool and steady. Frustration gnawed at him. Ruth's words had been too vivid, too precise to be invention. Yet here he stood with nothing he could publish, nothing he could prove. Without evidence, he was just another northerner slandering the South. "For now," he said quietly. But as they walked back toward the main house, Harrington noticed something. Near the barn, the earth was uneven, as though it had been turned and tamped down. Subtle depressions, faint rises, signs a trained eye might dismiss. But to him they looked like disturbed ground. He glanced toward the far section Ruth had described, the land Eleanor claimed she'd one day plant with an orchard. From a distance, it looked like barren rocky soil. Ordinary, unimportant. But Harrington's gut told him otherwise, that the truth he sought might be buried just beneath that patch of earth, waiting for the day someone dared to dig. There was something odd about the way the grass and brush grew on that patch of land patterns that didn't match the fields around it. And when Harrington pointed it out, Eleanor shrugged and said the soil was too rocky for cotton, and she simply hadn't had time to prepare it for an orchard. A future improvement on her list, which left him uneasy and uncertain. Riding back to Milledgeville with nothing concrete, unaware that the room he had inspected was exactly the show she intended him to see, a staged space, with empty barrels hiding a trap door that led to a cellar where the real work took place, and where 13 wooden boxes, each carefully labeled, held the records of every man buried in the rocky ground. Harrington spent another week in Georgia trying to turn Ruth's story into proof. But merchants, doctors, and planters all told the same thing. Eleanor was efficient and honest. The sales were documented, the buyers claimed they received what they paid for, and a runaway explanation fit neatly into the world that refused to listen to an enslaved woman's warning. So he returned to Boston in October and filed a short article that sank to page 7 and then sank out of memory, while Eleanor, watching the ripples she had made, saw danger instead of defeat. Because Ruth had spoken, and someone in the network had carried whispers north, which meant others might talk, which meant her carefully balanced system was suddenly exposed and fragile. So the night after she confirmed Harrington had left, she summoned Ruth to the parlor, poured water that trembled in the old woman's hands, told her gently that she had been found out. Then opened the iron box and unrolled her true case. The coded ledgers and precise sketches, and explained that every detail she had recorded was not a child's curiosity, but a weapon that each labeled face. Each measurement tied a young man to a prominent family. That the gray-green eyes of Isaac matched a senator's portrait. That the men she had buried were not murder victims to be hidden, but dead proof that could never deny lineage or flee testimony. And when Ruth, stunned and horrified, whispered that Eleanor had killed them, Eleanor replied coldly that she had preserved evidence because living proof could be sold, could run, could be silenced by lies while dead. Proof could be exhumed, measured, and shown to the world, so she had made the terrible choice, and now with a lawyer's letter rattling across state lines, she knew she had to move faster than she ever had planned. Eleanor answered Ruth with a cold calm that made the parlor feel smaller, saying that dead men stay where she put them, because dead men can be exhumed, their bones measured and compared, and bones do not lie. And when Ruth whispered that it was murder, Eleanor's face went hard, and she said what was evil was the system that created men like Isaac. The men raped and hidden by powerful families, that she was not the monster, but the reckoning that her work would force the truth into the open. Ruth asked about the equipment man, and Eleanor, for the first time, showing something like raw feeling, said he was her son, born to a man her father once owned, a child sent north to save a family name. The reason she understood the fight and would never stop, because her own blood would be destroyed if the truth stayed hidden, and in that moment Ruth realized this was no madness, but a long, calculated campaign of revenge that had already claimed 13 lives and seemed certain to continue. Ruth asked what she planned to do with the evidence, and Eleanor said she would wait for the moment when the country weakened, when war made everything vulnerable, and then she would release every name, every connection, mailing copies to papers north and south, to officials, and to churches, making the hypocrisy impossible to ignore, because the proof would be irrefutable. But she needed silence. And if Ruth spoke again, she would not only endanger Eleanor, but destroy the only chance they had to make those men pay. Ruth left that night with her hands shaking and her heart full of guilt, knowing 13 men were dead, and that she was now part of a secret she had never wanted. And over the next months, Eleanor sped up her work, buying 3 more young men between October 1856 and March 1857, chosen with even more care as she raced the clock in the coming war. While Henry began visiting more often, claiming to have closed his Philadelphia business and talking openly about moving south, staying weeks at a time as he and Eleanor prepared to finish the archive she believed would bring an empire to its knees. Mother and son had quietly turned Moss Creek into more than a plantation. They were building an insurance policy and a bomb, copying Eleanor's coded ledgers into plain English and stashing those copies in safes and law offices from Savannah to Charleston. And even with trusted contacts up in Pennsylvania, so the proof couldn't be destroyed with a single fire. And they upgraded their tradecraft too. The barn cellar became a laboratory where Henry, who'd studied medicine before choosing commerce, measured, sketched, took hair samples, and sometimes removed bones that carried unmistakable family markers, treating each corpse like a piece of forensic evidence rather than a human being. By spring 1857, the archive tied 17 of Georgia's most powerful families to hidden bloodlines. Senators, judges, merchants, and planters whose pedigrees depended on silence. And Eleanor believed she needed about 25 such links before exposure would trigger the cascade she wanted, one scandal igniting another until the whole elite structure burned. But then chance intervened in April. A Charleston cotton broker named William Thorne, the sort of man who read every line of an account instead of just the bottom line, noticed a pattern in her sales mail slaves sold at premium prices with the same notation: prime condition certified, and several names that never appeared again in buyers' records. Thorne left planning discreet checks with the buyers, and when Eleanor saw his carriage go, she finally felt real fear for the first time in years, knowing he might discover the missing men and bring back authorities or gossip that would flatten everything they had built. And in the study that night, Henry, pale in the window glass, urged immediate action. Take what they had. Release the files now, because the bubble they'd lived inside had been pierced, and the timetable they'd been racing against had just collapsed into urgent danger. Henry urged his mother to send out the documents immediately to unleash the evidence they had so carefully built. But Eleanor's reply was as cold as the stone walls of Moss Creek itself. 17 families weren't enough. A scandal that small could still be contained, discredited, buried by the weight of power and money. They needed more, she insisted, enough names and connections to make suppression impossible. That was when her voice changed from fear to calculation. She laid out the plan. William Thorne hadn't yet told anyone what he'd found. He would first try to confirm his suspicions, and that gave them a brief window to act. Henry froze when he realized what she was suggesting. To kill a white man, a Charleston broker respected and well-connected, was something entirely different from the disappearances they had orchestrated for years. Enslaved men vanished, and no one asked questions. But Thorne. His death would draw bloodhounds and militias. They'll hunt someone, Eleanor said flatly. But not me. Respectable widows aren't suspected of murder. Over 2 days they traced his habits. Thorne stayed at the Milledgeville Hotel, ate dinner at the same time every night, and walked the same quiet road to the river afterward, alone with only a pistol for comfort. On April 23, 1857, as the sun slipped low, a man in the rough clothes of a field hand appeared behind him. Hat brim, low stride, hurried and desperate. The report, in the Milledgeville Southern Recorder, later called it a robbery gone wrong. A slave likely escaped attacked Thorne, who fired once and missed. He was beaten with a blunt object, his skull shattered, his life ended in minutes. His money and watch were gone, but his satchel full of papers was untouched. A strange detail, but in the panic no one lingered on it. A manhunt spread across 20 miles of countryside. Patrols scoured plantations for missing slaves. None were found. The trail went cold, and another violent story sank into the dust of Georgia history. No one suspected that the killer had returned not to the woods, but to Moss Creek. That he had shed the stolen clothes in the barn cellar, scrubbed the blood from his hands, and sat that very evening in Eleanor's parlor, discussing cotton prices with a neighbor. Henry had killed for the first time. And though the plan had worked flawlessly, it marked a turning point. Eleanor had always told herself the deaths at Moss Creek were sacrifices necessary to build a weapon of truth. But Thorne wasn't part of the system she hated. He hadn't raped or enslaved or concealed bloodlines. He had simply noticed what others missed and asked questions. His death wasn't justice. It was a murder meant to keep their secret alive. And Henry felt the weight of it most. In the weeks after Thorne's killing, his certainty cracked. He still stood by his mother, still copied ledgers and recorded measurements, but silence hung heavier between them. The cause that had once felt righteous was beginning to look like something else, a mirror image of the evil they claimed to fight, a darkness consuming them both. If this story is giving you chills, if it's making you wonder whether justice bought with blood can ever truly be justice at all, share this video with someone who appreciates dark historical mysteries. Hit that like button to support content that digs into the shadows of our past, and make sure you're subscribed, because the conclusion of this story will overturn everything you thought you knew about Eleanor Cresswell's plan. The true consequence of William Thorne's murder was not legal for Eleanor, and Henry were never even whispered as suspects. The true consequence was personal. It forced Eleanor to confront what she had become. She told herself she was fighting injustice. But by then she had built her own system, and to protect it, she was willing to destroy anyone who threatened it. She had become the very thing she despised, a keeper of power by blood and by silence. The answer to what happened at Moss Creek did not come through investigation, but through history's accidents. When war erupted in 1861, Georgia was thrown into chaos. Plantations burned, records vanished, and the social order that sustained Eleanor's revenge collapsed in just 4 years. Eleanor herself died in 1863. Not exposed, not punished, but felled by pneumonia at age 54. Her neighbors believed she died peacefully. They never knew what she kept hidden under her floorboards. Henry vanished the next year, slipping into the fog of war. Some said he returned north. Others whispered he was killed in the violence of those final years. His fate has never been confirmed. The ledgers he and Eleanor had scattered for safekeeping were destroyed one by one. A Savannah bank burned. A Charleston lawyer died. Pennsylvania contacts disappeared or moved away. By 1865, Moss Creek was abandoned. The house fell into ruin. The barn collapsed in a storm in 1871. And beneath that rocky patch of earth, Eleanor had promised would one day hold an orchard, her secret remained buried for nearly 4 decades. In 1902, a developer preparing to build a school on the property struck bone. Workers uncovered skeleton after skeleton, 16 in all, along with wooden boxes filled with hair samples, sketches, and measurements. Newspapers seized the story, speculating wildly about who the men were, why they had been buried there, and who had kept such detailed records. But with Eleanor long dead, slavery abolished, and the families she had sought to expose faded into history. There was no trial, no reckoning. The find became a macabre curiosity, and then it faded. When the old house was torn down, workers found the iron box beneath the rotten floorboards of Eleanor's bedroom. Inside were ledgers written in cipher pages of sketches and notes about facial features, skin tone, bloodlines. The authorities could not understand them. The box was placed in a courthouse basement and forgotten. It wasn't until 1957, exactly 100 years after William Thorne's murder, that a graduate student stumbled upon the box while researching antebellum Georgia. Fascinated by the strange cipher, he spent 2 years unraveling it. What he found was so disturbing that his professors at first rejected his dissertation as unbelievable. But the code broke cleanly, and the contents spoke for themselves. Eleanor Creswell had meticulously documented 17 enslaved men as proof of their blood ties to Georgia's most powerful families. She had tracked their features, their histories, and beside their names, she wrote chilling notations, preserved for evidence. Evidence that meant murder. Evidence that turned her crusade into something darker. Evidence that still leaves us asking the same haunting question. Was she a visionary bent on exposing a system's hypocrisy? Or was she simply another monster born from it? The student's dissertation, published in 1959, caused ripples in academic circles, but barely a ripple in the wider world. By then, most of the families Eleanor Creswell had targeted were either gone diminished or stripped of the political power they once wielded. Her ledgers identified the men only by coded symbols and careful measurements, no names, no living descendants to cry out for justice. The story, when it finally came to light, lacked the human immediacy to spark the outrage Eleanor had spent her life anticipating. What her records did prove beyond argument was the hypocrisy at the heart of the antebellum South. The strict racial boundaries that Southern society claimed were immutable had been crossed again and again by the very men who thundered most loudly about their sanctity. Eleanor's evidence was precise, damning, and irrefutable. But by the time it emerged, the world had moved on. The revelations no longer shocked a society already transformed by war reconstruction and a century of shifting politics. What haunted scholars in the decades that followed wasn't whether Eleanor's accusations were true. They were. It was whether her methods could ever be defended. She had murdered at least 16 men, perhaps more. She had lied, manipulated, and calculated with ruthless patience. She had claimed to fight injustice while practicing her own brand of monstrous injustice. To some, Eleanor was a product of her world, a woman confronting a system so vile that only extreme measures seemed available. To others, she was a cautionary tale, proof that even noble intentions can rot into cruelty when filtered through obsession and vengeance. Those who had lived at Moss Creek left conflicting accounts. Some former slaves recalled Eleanor as strict, but no worse than other plantation mistresses. Others, especially Ruth, who survived until 1889, remembered an atmosphere of dread, an ever-present sense that something unnatural and menacing lurked beneath the daily rhythms of work. Ruth never revealed what Eleanor had confessed to her in 1856. Even in freedom, she carried that secret to her grave, perhaps understanding that some truths are too dangerous to release. The most disturbing element of the Moss Creek story is how close Eleanor came to success. If the Civil War had not consumed Georgia, if she had lived another few years, if William Thorne hadn't glimpsed a pattern in her ledgers, she might have unleashed her archive in a moment when it could have shaken the South to its core. She might have exposed hypocrisy on such a scale that entire families, dynasties, even political legacies collapsed under its weight. She might have forced the reckoning she dreamed of. But history rarely bends to individual plans. The war arrived, and with it the destruction of everything Eleanor had built. She died quietly of pneumonia, her archive hidden. Henry disappeared into the fog of conflict. The South she hated fell, but not by her hand, not by truth, not by exposure, not by the cascade of shame she imagined. It ended in fire and blood through armies and politics, leaving Eleanor's weapon nothing more than a chilling footnote. In the end, her grand design accomplished nothing but to add 16 more bodies to an already brutal age. The men she killed died for evidence that remained unread for a century. The families she despised collapsed for reasons wholly apart from her work. The system she loathed ended, but not in the way she wanted. And perhaps that is the final horror of Moss Creek, that so much careful plotting, so much cold cruelty, achieved nothing at all? Would you like me to rewrite this ending in the same chilling narrative style you've used for your video script, tightening it so it lands with the strongest possible impact for your audience? Today, Moss Creek exists only in memory. The plantation is gone, the land paved over by a shopping center. The rocky field where Eleanor Creswell buried her victims is now a parking lot. A single historical marker notes that Moss Creek once stood here, but it says nothing about what truly happened. Shoppers pass by every day, unaware that beneath the asphalt lie the remains of men whose names history erased, whose deaths fueled a plan that never reached its end. The infamous iron box, once hidden under Eleanor's floorboards, now sits in the archives of the Georgia Historical Society in Savannah. The ledgers have been translated and digitized, available to any researcher who requests them, yet few ever do. Eleanor's decades of obsessive documentation, her evidence of hypocrisy, her so-called weapon, are now little more than a historical curiosity, buried not in earth, but in academic obscurity. And maybe that is the cruelest irony. Eleanor wanted her revelations to be inescapable, impossible to ignore. She wanted to bring the South's hypocrisy to its knees. Instead, her archive became just another forgotten file, her truth a footnote in a history already crowded with overlooked tragedies. The evidence she preserved so carefully is available to anyone, but almost no one bothers to look. That leaves us with a final unsettling question. What do we do with evidence of evil when it comes too late to matter? Eleanor proved beyond doubt that Georgia's ruling class lived by lies, that their bloodlines crossed the very racial boundaries they declared sacred. But her proof surfaced a century too late, after the men she accused were dead, their families ruined by war, their world already gone. Does truth have value if it cannot bring justice? Does documenting atrocity matter if no one can be held accountable? This is the shadow Moss Creek casts across history. Was Eleanor Creswell a woman fighting injustice with the only weapons she believed she had? Or did she simply become another monster? Her murder staining her cause as surely as the institution she hated. Can violence ever serve justice, or does it always corrupt it in the end? What do you think? Was Eleanor's plan ever justified? Or was it doomed from the start? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this story unsettled you, if it made you rethink what justice and vengeance mean in the darkest corners of American history, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next story. We'll be back to explore more forgotten truths that refuse to stay buried. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next video.